It was late October when my friends and I decided to take a weekend trip upstate, just past the boundaries of where most GPS maps marked towns. We were looking for a place to get away from everything: traffic, phones, work, and the constant hum of city life. I didn't know the area well, just that the further we drove north, the more isolated it would get. My friend Jake, who owned the old Jeep we were taking, was excited about the idea of camping somewhere deep in the woods where no one could find us. He had a reputation for finding off-the-grid spots, and for some reason, I trusted him, even though his choices sometimes skirted on unsafe. The drive was long. The highway ended, and we followed winding back roads that narrowed until trees pressed on both sides like walls. The sun was starting to dip behind the hills, turning the sky a shade of dull orange, and the temperature dropped quickly. My friend Lena, who was in the back seat, kept fidgeting with her phone signal, which had vanished an hour ago. "Are you sure this is safe?" she asked, her voice tight. "I don't even see any houses, let alone a campsite." Jake shrugged. "That's the point. The place is out here, somewhere. Trust me." We passed a few rusted abandoned signs for private land, keep out, and no trespassing, but the road was open enough to drive through. By the time we hit what looked like a long gravel driveway disappearing into the forest, it was almost dark. Jake slowed, saying we were close. The Jeep hit rocks and potholes, bouncing over uneven ground. Finally, we came to a small clearing. It was barely big enough for the Jeep and some tents, but it was secluded. The forest seemed unnaturally silent, like even the wind didn't want to rustle the trees here. No birds, no insects. Just stillness. As we set up camp, I felt uneasy. Something about the place didn't sit right with me, but I brushed it off. I told myself it was just the isolation. The trees were thick, the shadows long, and the darkness settling in made everything look distorted. We built a fire, laughed, and told stories as the night got colder. Around 11 p.m., when the fire was low, I noticed a faint noise. At first, I thought it was a coyote or some nocturnal animal moving through the brush. But then it became a distinct sound, like someone walking carefully, stopping every few steps. I turned to Jake. "Do you hear that?" "Probably just animals," he said, trying to sound casual, but I could tell he was listening too. The sound grew closer, and then there was a pause. Nothing moved. Lena, sitting by the fire, hugged her knees. "That doesn't sound like animals," she whispered. I grabbed a flashlight and shone it toward the tree line. The beam didn't reveal anything, but the rustling started again, now from a different angle. It was circling us. I felt my stomach tighten. "Maybe we should just go to sleep," Jake said, finally admitting a hint of concern. I didn't want to argue. We went to our tents, locking zippers and checking our gear. But the noises didn't stop. If anything, they grew louder, like something, or someone, was walking around, stepping carefully, watching. Around 2 a.m., I woke to a sound of something dragging across the ground. It was outside my tent. I froze, trying to breathe silently. Lena's voice came faintly through the thin fabric. "Is someone out there?" I whispered. "I don't know. Stay quiet." The dragging stopped. Then there was a slow, deliberate knock against one of the trees nearby. Thump, thump, thump. Each hit was measured, like someone testing the strength of the wood. I felt paralyzed. Jake's voice eventually whispered, "We need to leave, now." I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent. The beam cut across the clearing speck, but the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally. I didn't see anyone, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I started the Jeep silently, hoping the engine would scare whatever it was away. That's when I saw it. At the edge of the trees, partially hidden behind the trunks, was a figure. It was tall, unnaturally thin, and completely still. I couldn't make out features, only the vague outline of a person. My heart pounded. I turned to Lena, whispering for her to stay in the car. Jake jumped out of the Jeep, holding a flashlight like a weapon, shining it toward the figure. It didn't move. But then, without warning, it started walking toward us. Slow, deliberate steps that didn't sound like normal human movement. The forest seemed to bend around it, like the darkness followed its motion. "Get in!" I yelled, slamming the Jeep into reverse. Lena screamed as we bounced back over the rocks, tires skidding. Jake jumped in just in time, and we sped down the gravel path, headlights cutting through the darkness. We drove for what felt like hours, though in reality it was probably 30 minutes. No other lights, no sign of roads or civilization, just dense forest on either side. But every once in a while, I could swear I saw it in the distance, standing still, watching us pass. Eventually, the road opened onto a two-lane highway. We slowed, almost too relieved to speak. Lena, still shaking, finally found a weak cell signal and called 911. They asked for our location, but when we tried to describe the back roads and the gravel path, it became clear we were somewhere uncharted. We stayed in a motel that night, unable to sleep. Every little sound outside the room made me jump. In the morning, I wanted to go back home, to safety. But curiosity gnawed at me. I wanted to know what we had seen, or if we'd imagined it. Jake insisted we return, saying he wanted to figure out if it was just someone playing a prank. Against my better judgment, we went back 3 days later, during daylight, hoping to see the clearing again. The forest was empty. No signs of the Jeep, no campsite, not even the gravel path we had driven on before. It was like the clearing had never existed. GPS didn't recognize any of the roads, no trail markers. It was as if the area had swallowed us the night before. I tried to research the location, asking locals in the nearest town about the area if anyone reported strange sightings or missing persons. No one had heard of it. They called it backwoods, empty, off limits, but nothing unusual. Still, I couldn't shake the memory of the figure. Tall, thin, moving unnaturally, circling us. It didn't feel human. The way it moved, the silence around it, it was wrong in a way I couldn't explain. And the dragging sound, whatever it was, it followed us all the way back to the highway. I thought maybe we had been hallucinating from exhaustion or that shadows played tricks on our eyes, but Lena had seen it too. Jake didn't want to talk much about it, just said, "Let's forget it." But the memory haunted me. I couldn't sleep without seeing its silhouette at the edge of my vision. Every rustle in the dark made my heart jump. Months later, I learned about a series of disappearances in rural areas upstate. Mostly hikers, campers, sometimes locals who vanished without a trace. Nothing was ever solved. Maps of the area were incomplete, and when investigators went to search, they often couldn't find the exact locations reported. I can't explain what we saw. Part of me wants to believe it was a person, someone living off the grid, stalking lost travelers. But it didn't feel human. Its movements, its silence, the way the forest seemed to shift around it, it was wrong. Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there in the places between roads, waiting. And I know one thing for sure. If I ever go back into the middle of nowhere, I'll never go unarmed, and I'll never underestimate the darkness. Even now, when I drive through empty stretches of road late at night, I check the edges of the forest. I watch the shadows. I listen for footsteps that don't belong. And every time I hear the faintest drag across the ground or a branch snap that doesn't match the wind, I remember the clearing, the figure, and the way it felt to know that something was out there, just watching. I've told very few people what happened that night. Most would call me crazy, and maybe I am, but I know what I saw. I know how it felt to be trapped in the middle of nowhere, with something just beyond the edge of sight, patient, waiting. The thing is, it wasn't random. It knew we were there. It watched us, studied us, and didn't reveal itself fully, at least not until we tried to leave. And even then, it didn't chase us, didn't run. It just let us go, following silently until we were back in civilization. I've avoided going back north since then. I've driven past countless rural roads, but none of them matched the path we took. And I wonder if it's always like that. Places that exist only when they want to, roads that appear and disappear, and whatever is out there waiting only shows itself when the time is right. Sometimes, late at night, I think I can still feel it. Not outside, not in my room, but in that quiet edge of my mind that refuses to forget. And I realize that some places are better left unknown, some shadows better left unexamined. Even now, when I hear friends talking about camping out in the middle of nowhere, I feel a cold dread, because I know what is really out there. And I know that one day, if you're not careful, it might decide it's watching you next. Story the end. It was one of those late summer nights when the air feels heavier than usual and even the crickets seem hesitant to make a sound. My friends and I had decided to take a road trip to escape the city, chasing the idea of adventure into the back roads of West Virginia. We weren't the most experienced drivers for long stretches in isolated areas, but we thought we were prepared. The sun had already set, already set when we left the last town with any real civilization behind us, and the GPS signal flickered in and out, as if protesting our venture into nowhere. The road narrowed to a single lane, winding through dense woods that pressed in from both sides. Headlights barely pierced the dark, and shadows danced unnaturally in the corners of our vision. Our car, a slightly beat-up SUV with more miles on it than we cared to acknowledge, rattled and groaned over potholes that seemed to appear out of nowhere. We joked about horror movies and urban legends, because what else can you do when your pulse starts matching the thump of your tires on uneven asphalt? I was driving, with my friend Jenna navigating beside me. She had a habit of obsessively checking the map on her phone, even though the signal was spotty. Behind us, our other friends, Mark and Sam, were dozing lightly, lulled by the monotony of the road and the faint hum of the air conditioner. It was supposed to be a short detour to a camping spot that Mark had heard about from an old friend, some hidden clearing far off the beaten path. None of us were familiar with the area, but the thrill of being off the grid was intoxicating. After about an hour of bumping along the winding road, Jenna pointed out a sign that we had all missed. It was almost completely worn down, the paint chipped and peeling, reading something like Old Hollow, next 12 miles. The more we looked at it, the less sure we were of the spelling or even the exact words. "That's it," she said, a little nervously. "This has to be the road to the clearing." We continued, though the road quickly became more of a dirt path than anything else. The trees arched over us, branches scraping the roof of the car like skeletal fingers. The GPS had given up entirely, leaving us to rely solely on the vague directions Jenna had printed out before we left. It was somewhere around 10:45 p.m. when we noticed the first oddity. A figure, barely visible, was standing at the edge of the road up ahead. It looked like a man, maybe middle-aged, wearing some kind of dark, tattered coat. At first, we thought he was a hitchhiker, but as we got closer, we realized he wasn't moving, not stepping aside, not waving, just standing. And then, without any warning, he was gone. No turning around, no moving to the woods, just gone. "Did you see that?" Jenna whispered, gripping the dashboard. "Aye. I think so," I said, slowing the car. Mark and Sam were both awake now, blinking at us in confusion. We laughed it off nervously, attributing it to our imagination. The road continued to twist through the forest, and soon we reached a point where the path split in two, both equally dark, equally foreboding. The directions said to take a right, but there was nothing but dense blackness beyond the trees. No signs, no markers, nothing. "I swear it was right here," Jenna muttered. She got out of the car and shone her flashlight down both paths. The beam barely cut through the gloom. "This doesn't make sense. This isn't what the directions said." "Maybe we missed a turn," Sam suggested, but his voice lacked conviction. There was an unspoken tension that had settled over us. The woods were too silent, too still. Even the air felt heavier, as though we had crossed some threshold into a place that wasn't entirely part of the world. After a few minutes, we decided to trust our instincts and pick the right path. It was narrower, overgrown, and the tires scraped against hidden rocks. Every so often, we would catch glimpses of movement in the shadows, shapes that weren't quite animals, not quite human, darting between the trees. Mark kept muttering under his breath, something about old stories. His uncle used to tell about this area, about people disappearing along these roads, about hollowed places. I didn't think much of it at the time, but looking back, I should have listened. An hour later, we finally found what appeared to be the clearing. There was a small cabin, decrepit and leaning to one side, surrounded by overgrown grass. The windows were dark, and the door hung slightly ajar. There was a fire pit in front, long cold, surrounded by charred logs. We parked the car and got out, stretching and shaking off the tension. The air smelled damp, earthy, and faintly metallic, like blood or rust. "Pretty creepy," Jenna said, her voice tight. "But it'll make a good story." We unpacked our gear and set up tents a little distance from the cabin. We debated whether to explore it, but agreed to wait until morning. We tried to make light of it, telling jokes, roasting marshmallows, and playing music softly from our phones. Still, there was a constant feeling of being watched. Every rustle of the trees made us jump. Every shadow seemed to linger longer than it should. Around 2 a.m., we heard the first noise that made us truly uneasy. A tapping sound, soft at first, then louder, coming from the direction of the cabin. Mark insisted it was probably an animal, but the pattern didn't match any animal we knew. The tapping was deliberate, almost rhythmic, like someone knocking. "I'm going to check it out," I said, grabbing a flashlight and heading toward the cabin. Jenna tried to protest, but I felt a mix of curiosity and defiance that I couldn't shake. As I approached, the knocking stopped. I swung the flashlight around the exterior, catching only the decaying wood and shadows. I called out, "Hello?" But only my voice answered back, echoing strangely in the trees. I stepped inside the cabin and the smell hit me first, a pungent, acidic odor that made my stomach churn. The floorboards creaked under my weight, and I shone the flashlight across the room. Old furniture was scattered haphazardly, covered in dust and cobwebs. There were markings on the walls, scratches, symbols I didn't recognize, circles and lines etched deep enough to feel the texture beneath my fingers. Then I saw it. A photograph, pinned to the wall, black and white, faded. It was of a family, smiling at the camera, standing in front of what looked like this very cabin. At first, nothing seemed wrong, but then I noticed their eyes, cut out, torn away. It made no sense, and I felt my stomach drop. I spun around, about to call for the others, but the door slammed shut behind me with a force that rattled the walls. Panicked, I ran for the door, yanking at the handle. It wouldn't budge. I turned, shining the flashlight across the room, and caught a movement in the far corner. A shadow shifted, darker than the darkness itself. My heart pounded as I stumbled backward, tripping over something. It was a small pile of bones, human, arranged deliberately on the floor. The air grew colder, and the knocking started again, this time from inside the walls themselves. I screamed for my friends, and miraculously, the door swung open. I bolted outside, gasping, and found them all staring at me with wide eyes. "What happened?" Jenna asked. I couldn't explain. I just shook my head, words failing me. We decided then to pack up immediately, abandoning the tents and cabin. As we drove off, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing in the clearing. There was nothing, only the black void of the woods, silent and still. The ride back was tense. None of us spoke much, each lost in our thoughts, replaying every moment, every shadow, every movement we had dismissed as our imagination. The moon was barely visible through the thick trees, and the road seemed endless, winding, twisting, looping back on itself as if trying to trap us. Somewhere around 4 a.m., the SUV's engine sputtered and died. We were in the middle of nowhere, miles from the nearest town, and no cell service. We tried to restart it, but it was useless. Jenna and I got out to push, trying to see if we could reach the next stretch of paved road. That's when we saw him, or them. Figures standing along the road, far off, maybe 50 yards away. Too dark to make out clearly, but definitely human-shaped. They didn't move, didn't speak, just watched. Mark panicked, and Sam tried to rationalize it as hikers, but the way the figures were spread out, perfectly spaced, perfectly still, it didn't feel natural. As we pushed the car, one figure stepped forward slowly, and I felt a wave of nausea and dread wash over me. There was something in the way it moved, unnatural, jerky, almost like a puppet being pulled by invisible strings. We managed to get the car started eventually, but the figures followed along the edge of the woods for miles. Every time we slowed, they appeared closer. The fear in the car was suffocating, a silence heavier than the night itself. Finally, the trees began to thin, and we spotted headlights in the distance. Another car, the first sign of civilization in hours. We didn't slow down, didn't look back. Once we reached the next town, we pulled into a gas station, shaking, pale, silent. No one believed us when we tried to describe the road, the cabin, the figures. Local authorities said there was no record of an old hollow in the area, no abandoned cabin matching the description, no reports of missing persons tied to that stretch of road. We never went back. Even years later, when we drive through West Virginia, the idea of those twisting, isolated back roads makes my stomach turn. I've tried to rationalize it, to tell myself it was the stress, the darkness, maybe even hallucinations. But sometimes when I'm alone at night, I can still see those figures at the edge of the woods, standing perfectly still, waiting for the next car to wander too far from the road. I know what we saw was real, because it wasn't just the figures or the cabin or the photograph. It was that feeling. The sense that we had trespassed into a place that had rules entirely its own, and the world outside had no power there. The fear, the silence, the cold that seemed to seep into our bones. It followed us long after the road ended, long after we left the forest behind. Sometimes I dream of that place. I see the clearing, the cabin, the shadows. And every time I wake up with the same dread, knowing that somewhere far back in those woods something still remembers us, still waits, still watches. I've never spoken about it publicly, not in full detail, not to anyone who hasn't experienced it themselves. Because it's not a story to be shared lightly. It's a warning. There are places in this country, backroads, forests, abandoned cabins, where the rules of the ordinary world don't apply, where time, space, and reason bend, and whatever is out there doesn't care who you are or what you think you know. We never returned to West Virginia, never sought out Old Hollow again. But sometimes, when the wind shifts, I think I hear the tapping again, soft at first, just on the edge of hearing, and I remember there are places in the middle of nowhere that should never be found. Story the end. It was a Friday evening in late September when Ben and his friend Jake decided to take a spontaneous road trip. Both in their late 20s, they had been cooped up in the city for months, worn down by work, bills, and the monotonous routine of adult life. The idea was simple: escape the congestion, drive somewhere unknown, and let the night take them wherever it wanted. They didn't plan too far, just a loose notion of heading west, chasing fading sunlight and the quiet of the open road. They packed a couple of duffel bags, grabbed snacks, loaded up their old rusty Ford pickup, and hit the highway just as the city lights were beginning to blur into the distance. At first, the trip felt liberating. The air was crisp, the roads nearly empty, and the stars were unusually bright in the sky. They laughed, played old mixtapes, and joked about camping somewhere in the middle of nowhere. Hours passed, and the city behind them shrank into nothingness. Highway signs gave way to gravel roads, and the occasional farmhouse punctuated stretches of cornfields. By the time they realized how far out they'd gone, the sun had set completely, leaving only the beams of their headlights cutting through darkness. They came upon an old gas station at a crossroads. A single pump, half lit, with peeling paint and a faint smell of diesel. The lights flickered, giving the place a sketchy, abandoned feel. They pulled in, hoping to stretch their legs and grab some caffeine. The bell above the door jingled as they entered, but there was no one behind the counter. Dust-covered shelves displayed snacks and sodas that probably hadn't sold in years. A small radio played faintly in the corner, a static-filled country station struggling to break through. Ben called out, "Hello?" No response. They glanced at each other, shrugged, and wandered around, poking through the aisles. Jake found a pack of cheap jerky and a bottle of water. Ben grabbed a coffee machine cup from the counter, figuring the machine might still work. He pressed the button, and it sputtered, wheezing to life, but the coffee that came out was barely warm, more sludge than beverage. "Charming," Jake muttered. "Perfect middle-of-nowhere experience." They laughed it off and paid with cash left on the counter, a crumpled dollar bill tucked in a jar labeled "Help Yourself." The transaction felt odd, almost ghostly in its casualness, but the thought of it being sketchy never fully clicked. Back on the road, the landscape changed. Trees grew thicker, creating tunnels of shadow that swallowed the headlights, and the occasional rusted sign warned of deer crossings. It wasn't long before their GPS lost signal completely. "We're really out here," Ben said, tapping the screen. "No bars, no directions. Just darkness." Jake grinned. "That's the point, man. Isn't this exactly what we wanted?" For a while, they enjoyed the isolation, the hum of the engine, and the distant call of a lone owl. But soon the quiet began to feel oppressive. The trees seemed closer, almost pressing in from either side of the narrow road. Ben tried to joke, making up stories about ghosts and serial killers, but the laughter felt hollow, fading faster than it came. Hours passed, or maybe it was less. They weren't sure. The road twisted and turned with no familiar markers, and the sky, now clouded, hid the stars. Then they saw it, a small cabin with faint light flickering in one of the windows. Relief washed over them. The idea of stopping for the night, finding a semblance of civilization, was too tempting to resist. They parked in front and approached cautiously. The cabin's porch sagged under the weight of years, boards creaking with each step. The door, surprisingly, was unlocked. Ben nudged it open, calling out softly, Hello? Anybody here? Silence. The room inside smelled of damp wood and smoke, but it was mostly empty. There was a worn-out couch, a small table with a candle stub, and a fireplace long cold. On the wall there was a photograph of a family, smiling faces frozen in time, but someone had scratched out the eyes with black ink. Ben felt a shiver run down his spine. Jake shrugged. Maybe they're artistic, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Ben stepped further in, feeling the floorboards moan underfoot. He checked the windows. Outside, the trees swayed violently with a sudden gust of wind, casting moving shadows. He turned back to Jake. Maybe we shouldn't stay too long. Just rest a bit, then keep going. Jake agreed, but as they tried to settle, strange things began. The candle on the table, which they had lit to feel less claustrophobic, flickered despite the absence of wind inside. Footsteps echoed upstairs, soft but deliberate. The two exchanged a glance. There's nobody up there, Jake whispered. It's probably old wood, settling. But the footsteps didn't stop. They paced slowly, measured, like someone or something was pacing right above them, listening. The sound was hypnotic, almost musical in a chilling way, and their laughter from earlier was gone entirely. Ben's phone buzzed, a message from a wrong number. It read, "Get out." He froze, staring at the tiny screen. The number didn't belong to anyone he knew. He showed Jake. Jake laughed nervously. Probably a prank, man. Some kid sending random texts. Another buzz. "Leave now. Don't look back." The laughter completely died. They checked the cabin again. There were still no signs of anyone else. The air grew heavier, almost viscous. Each sound seemed amplified, the scratching of the trees against the walls, the distant howl of a coyote, the faint hum of what sounded like a generator far off in the woods. Ben tried to rationalize. It's probably the wind, the power lines, something explaining itself eventually. But then they heard a voice, a low whisper, barely audible, coming from the fireplace. "Stay. With us." Jake grabbed Ben's arm. "We're leaving. Now." They bolted for the truck, but when they got outside, the landscape had changed. The cabin was no longer where it had been, or perhaps it never had been. The road stretched endlessly into darkness, flanked by trees that seemed to grow taller and denser, swallowing the headlights. They tried the GPS again. Nothing. The radio, when turned on, emitted only static, interrupted by faint, indistinguishable whispers. Panic started to creep in. The longer they drove, the more the trees seemed to press closer, the headlights slicing through an ever-thickening gloom. Then they saw them. Figures. Silhouettes in the distance, moving slowly along the roadside, just at the edge of visibility. They didn't wave, didn't approach, didn't retreat. They simply watched. "Don't stop," Ben shouted, gripping the wheel. The figures didn't move aside as they passed. They seemed to multiply, appearing wherever the headlights swept, standing perfectly still. The road twisted, and it felt as though, no matter which direction they turned, the figures were always in front of them, behind them, like in the shadows between the trees. A sudden noise erupted from the back of the truck. They slammed the brakes, and Ben jumped out to check. The bed of the pickup was empty. No footprints in the dirt, no signs of anyone else. Jake's hands shook as he muttered, What? What is happening?" They started driving again, faster this time, hearts pounding. Every mile seemed longer than the last, as if the road itself had stretched. Their headlights flickered, briefly revealing glimpses of faces, pale, expressionless, staring from between the trees. Hours passed in a blur of terror and exhaustion. Sleep-deprived and terrified, they finally noticed a faint glow ahead. Hope, relief. A small sign read, "Welcome to Daltonville." They entered the town slowly, half expecting it to vanish the moment they drove closer. The streets were empty, but the houses looked maintained, windows glowing warmly. For the first time in what felt like eternity, they exhaled. But something was off. No cars, no people, no sound of life except a faint wind rustling through the leaves. The town felt frozen, unnervingly perfect. They stopped at a diner, the kind that should have been open 24 hours. The door creaked as they entered, but inside it was empty. Coffee pots still sat on the burners, steam rising as if someone had been there moments ago. They sat down, unsure what to do. Then, through the foggy window, they saw movement outside, figures emerging from the shadows, lining the streets. Not walking, not approaching, just watching. Ben felt a chill run down his spine. A voice whispered from behind the counter, "You're never leaving." They turned. No one was there, only the faint echo of laughter, long and thin, bouncing off the walls. Panic surged, and they bolted from the diner, sprinted back to the truck, and drove. Daltonville disappeared almost instantly as they passed what should have been the town limits. The trees, endless and oppressive, swallowed the road again. Every turn felt the same, every mile a repetition. It was impossible to tell how long they had been driving, but exhaustion won over fear for a brief moment, and they fell into a fitful, uneasy sleep behind the wheel. They woke at dawn, the light finally breaking through the dense canopy. They were on a dirt road, miles from anything recognizable. The truck was intact, the engines still running. The morning sun revealed something terrifying: tire tracks that led in endless circles back to where they had started. The road behind them, behind the endless trees, showed no signs of civilization ever existing there. The gas station, the cabin, Daltonville, all gone, leaving no trace but the shadows in their memory. They drove until the sun was high, eventually finding a highway, a real highway, where cars passed and the world felt normal again. When they finally returned to the city, they tried telling people what happened. Friends laughed, claiming exhaustion and imagination. But Ben and Jake knew. They didn't need anyone to believe them. Sometimes, late at night, Ben would dream of those figures in the woods, the whispering voices, the frozen town, and the tire tracks that led nowhere. And when the city was quiet enough, he swore he could hear faint footsteps pacing above his ceiling, counting, waiting. Jake never left his side after that trip. They avoided roads that were too isolated, never went out of town again without company, and never spoke of Daltonville, the cabin, or the gas station in casual conversation. But both knew, deep down, that what they encountered was real, and that the middle of nowhere sometimes isn't empty at all. Years later, they would sometimes catch a glimpse of a familiar shadow in the corner of their eyes, a tall figure just beyond the headlights when driving late, motionless, patient. And though they would never speak it aloud, both understood the unspoken truth. Once the middle of nowhere grabs you, it never fully lets go. Story the end. It was the middle of October when Emily decided to take a solo weekend trip. She had recently ended a long-term relationship, and the weight of city life was pressing in on her. She wanted nothing more than to disappear for a couple of days. No phones, no obligations, just the open road and the silence of the wild. She packed a small backpack, grabbed her old Jeep, and drove west, chasing nothing but empty highways and the promise of isolation. The first few hours were pleasant. Trees blurred past the window, their autumn leaves painted in gold and crimson. She passed small towns with diners and gas stations, but none felt right for a stop. She wanted the solitude, wanted to feel invisible. By the time the sun began to dip below the horizon, the streets had thinned to near nothingness. The GPS began to falter, giving vague instructions that led her off paved roads onto gravel trails that wound through dense woods. Emily wasn't afraid. Not yet. The quiet was intoxicating. The only sounds were the tires crunching on gravel and the occasional crow cawing from the treetops. She passed a small, abandoned farmhouse. Its windows were broken and the roof sagged dangerously. For some reason, she felt drawn to it. A fleeting thought told her to keep driving, but curiosity, or maybe foolishness, won. She parked the Jeep and got out, the air cooler than she expected. The farmhouse was eerily still. The door creaked open with ease, and the inside smelled of rot and decay. Broken furniture was scattered across the floor. On the wall, faint scratches formed strange patterns. Emily didn't understand them, but something in her stomach twisted. She turned to leave, and that's when she heard it. A soft thump upstairs. She froze. "Hello?" she called softly. No answer. Only the sound of thumping continued, slow and rhythmic, like someone walking deliberately above her. Emily's heart raced. She stepped backward, tripping over a chair, and that's when she saw it. A shadow moving along the staircase, but it had no distinct form, just a dark smear that stretched and bent as it descended. Panic surged. She bolted back to her Jeep, fumbling with the keys as the shadow seemed to linger in the corner of her vision. The engine roared to life, tires spinning as she accelerated down the gravel road. For a few miles, everything was silent, but then the headlights caught movement, figures standing along the roadside, watching, completely still. Emily swerved, but the figures remained in the same positions, appearing wherever the Jeep turned. Trees pressed closer, forming walls of darkness that swallowed the light. The radio crackled to life with distorted voices whispering her name. Emily, Emily. She didn't know how long she drove. Hours? Minutes? The sky was a black void with no stars, and the road seemed endless. Then, suddenly, she saw it, a small motel sign, glowing faintly in the distance. Salvation, or so she thought. The motel was empty, abandoned yet strangely well maintained. The neon sign flickered. Vacancy. Emily pulled in, desperate to stop. She entered the office. The keys hung on the wall, labeled with numbers, but the room beyond was dark, a long hallway leading to rooms with closed doors. She picked a key at random and walked down the hall. Then she heard whispers again, louder this time. Stay. Stay. Don't leave. The voices seemed to come from inside the walls, curling around her like smoke. The air grew heavy. She opened the door to her assigned room, only to find it empty except for a single chair facing the window. On the chair sat a small, ragged notebook with a page open, words scrawled in jagged letters. You should not have come here. Emily's hands shook. She grabbed the notebook, intending to leave, but the door slammed shut behind her. She rattled the handle. It wouldn't budge. The room grew colder, and in the reflection of the window, she saw them. Dozens of faces pressed against the glass, pale and emotionless. Screaming, she smashed the window and leapt into the parking lot. The motel was gone. Where it should have been, there were only trees, stretching endlessly in every direction. The Jeep's headlights revealed figures moving slowly toward her, walking in unnatural silence, always keeping pace no matter how fast she ran. Emily jumped into the Jeep, driving frantically down a road that seemed to twist in on itself. Every turn she made led to the same pattern. More figures, more trees, more shadows in the distance. The GPS refused to work, the radio screamed, and somewhere deep in the woods a low, guttural laughter echoed. She drove until dawn, when the light revealed a dirt road leading to a small, real town. She could see houses, smoke rising from chimneys, and the distant hum of morning life. Relief washed over her, but it was short-lived. As she passed a cracked roadside mirror, she glimpsed the back seat. There, sitting quietly, were dozens of pale faces staring silently at her from the shadows. She slammed on the brakes, but the Jeep wouldn't stop. Then, with a terrifying jolt, it was gone. Emily woke in the driver's seat, miles from the town, the sun just rising, the Jeep completely intact, and the road stretching endlessly. She drove for hours, eventually reaching civilization. She never spoke about what happened, never returned to the highways leading west, and avoided traveling alone at night. But the memories stayed. The whispering voices, the endless figures, the motel that wasn't there, it haunted her dreams. Sometimes while driving late at night, she would see a shadow at the edge of the headlights, still moving with patient inevitability. She knew, without doubt, that the middle of nowhere was never empty, and that it could wait. Years later, she would still feel it, the lingering presence of those who waited, watching the roads, patient, silent. And she knew that once you've been caught by the middle of nowhere, even if you escape, it never fully lets go. Story the end. It was a sweltering July afternoon when the air conditioner in my old pickup finally gave out. I was headed from Illinois to visit a friend in northern Colorado, but I'd taken a wrong turn hours ago and ended up deep in some forgotten county of Nebraska. My GPS had stopped working about 50 miles back, and every time I tried to reload the map on my phone, all I got was a gray screen with no signal. The two-lane blacktop I was on stretched endlessly into the horizon, with nothing but sun-bleached fields and old windbreaks of pine trees. There hadn't been a gas station in at least an hour, and my tank was getting low. I kept telling myself there had to be a small town somewhere up ahead, but all I saw was an old wooden sign leaning at an angle, the paint so faded I couldn't even read the name. The road narrowed, the pavement cracked, and soon it was more gravel than asphalt. The heat shimmered in the distance, distorting the horizon like a mirage. That's when I saw it, a narrow dirt track leading off to the right. It wasn't marked, but there were tire ruts, and desperation made me turn. I figured it might lead to a farmhouse where I could ask for directions. As soon as my tires left the main road, it felt like stepping into another world. The noise of the wind dropped, and the sound of gravel under my tires became muted, like I was driving on carpet. I drove for what felt like forever, my hands slick with sweat on the steering wheel. The trees grew thicker around the road, their branches hanging low, blocking the sky. It was cooler here, the sunlight dimming as though it was sunset, even though my watch said it was only 4 p.m. Finally, the road opened into a clearing, and there it was, a small, abandoned-looking gas station with two ancient pumps out front and a wooden shack for an office. Relieved, I parked. The pumps were rusted but intact. The sign on the shack said fuel in blocky letters, with most of the paint peeled away. There were no cars, no people, but I thought maybe someone lived inside. I stepped out of the truck, the air unnaturally still. Even the insects were silent. I called out, "Hello? Anyone here?" No answer. I circled the shack and found a door with a single window covered in grime. Inside was dark, but I thought I saw movement. I knocked lightly, then harder. "Hey! I'm low on gas. Can I pay you for a fill-up?" Silence. Then, from inside, a faint sound. It wasn't a voice exactly, more like a shuffle, something dragging across the wooden floor. I took a step back. The door creaked open, just an inch. No one stood there. Just darkness. I felt a chill crawl up my neck. "Look, if this is a bad time, I'll just leave." The door swung wider slowly, like someone unseen was pulling it. The interior was pitch black despite the daylight. I turned to leave, but then I saw the pump handle move on its own, swinging gently like someone had just brushed past it. My breath caught. That's when I noticed something odd about the trees at the edge of the clearing. They weren't spaced normally. They were arranged in a circle around the station, all leaning slightly inward, as if growing toward the building. And between the trunks, shadows pooled unnaturally, too dark for daytime. I backed toward my truck, heart pounding. My instincts screamed at me to get in and drive. But as I reached for the handle, I saw something in the reflection of the side mirror. A figure stood at the edge of the clearing. Tall, thin, completely still. Its outline was wrong. 2 long arms, legs that bent slightly the wrong way. No face, just a pale suggestion of one. I spun around. Nothing was there. I climbed into the truck, slamming the door. My hands shook as I turned the key. The engine coughed, but didn't start. I tried again. Nothing. The sound of dragging began again, this time outside, circling the truck, gravel crunching under slow, deliberate steps. The sound moved behind me, then to the other side. I locked the doors, even though I knew a lock wouldn't matter. Then came the knock. 3 slow thuds on the roof of the cab. Not hard, but steady. I couldn't breathe. I turned the key again, and the engine roared to life. Gravel sprayed as I floored it, speeding down the dirt track as fast as the truck would go. My eyes flicked to the mirror, and there it was again at the edge of the road, a tall, thin figure, standing in the trees, watching me. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I drove until the dirt track became gravel, then cracked pavement, then finally a real road. The sun was high again, the sky bright and blue, like nothing had happened. My GPS flickered back to life, showing me a route to the nearest town. When I stopped for gas at a modern station 20 miles later, the attendant asked me where I'd been driving from. I told him about the old gas station down the dirt road. He frowned. "There hasn't been a station out there for 30 years. Burned down in the 80s. I swore I had just been there. I described the shack, the pumps, the sign. His expression grew uneasy. "People go missing out that way sometimes. Hunters, travelers, best not to drive those roads." I left, shaken. For weeks I had nightmares about that clearing, the circle of leaning trees, the silent shadows, and the figure watching me. Sometimes in my dreams it's closer, its head tilted at an impossible angle, its hands dragging on the ground as it moves toward me. Even now, years later, whenever I'm driving through empty stretches of rural highway, I check my rearview mirror more than I should. I can't shake the feeling that if I take the wrong turn again, I'll end up back there, at that station in the middle of nowhere, with that thing waiting for me in the shadows, and this time, maybe it won't let me leave. Story, the end. It started as a simple road trip. Mark, Lisa, and Daniel had been friends since college, and the 3 of them liked escaping the city on weekends, looking for quiet roads, empty forests, and the kind of isolation that made a person feel free. They found a map online showing a remote area in southern Missouri, a place that promised solitude and an untouched river bend perfect for camping. No cell towers, no other humans, just them and the wilderness. They left Friday afternoon, taking Mark's old SUV loaded with camping gear, snacks, and a cooler full of drinks. The drive was long, but enjoyable. They passed rolling hills, farmland, and eventually thick patches of forest. Traffic disappeared after a while, and the radio dropped to static, leaving them with nothing but the hum of the engine and occasional laughter. Eventually, the asphalt gave way to gravel. The road narrowed, twisting between dense trees that blocked most of the late afternoon sun. Mark slowed down, checking the map. "Should be just up ahead," he said, though his voice betrayed uncertainty. The GPS flickered, struggling to lock a signal. "I think it's around the next bend." Hours later, they reached a clearing marked by a dilapidated wooden sign, half covered in vines. Faded letters indicated a trail leading to a river. They parked and unloaded, the forest around them darkening as the sun dipped lower. Lisa suggested they set up camp near the riverbank, while Daniel wanted to explore a little. They argued briefly, but in the end, Daniel's curiosity won. They followed a narrow, overgrown trail that seemed to twist endlessly. The forest grew unnaturally quiet, the usual sounds of birds or insects strangely absent. Occasionally, they would hear a branch snap behind them, only to turn and find nothing. Lisa tried to laugh it off, but her voice sounded small against the towering trees. After an hour, they stumbled upon a clearing, and in the center, a small, abandoned cabin sat, almost hidden by overgrowth. The windows were broken, and the roof sagged in the middle. Daniel wanted to investigate, but Mark pulled him back. "No, let's just keep moving. Looks haunted." Lisa agreed reluctantly, though a chill ran down her spine. They made it to the river just before sunset. The water was clear, running over smooth stones, reflecting the orange glow of the sky. They set up a small campfire and cooked some food, trying to push away the growing unease. That night, the forest was alive with sounds, strange and heavy, whispers that seemed almost human, rustling that sounded like footsteps pacing just beyond the firelight. They stayed close to the fire, trying to convince themselves it was just the wind. In the early hours of the morning, Mark woke to the feeling of being watched. He nudged Lisa and Daniel, whispering, "Do you hear that?" There was silence at first, then faint breathing, slow, deliberate, and unnervingly close. When they shone a flashlight toward the tree line, nothing moved, but the sense of eyes on them was overwhelming. They huddled together, too afraid to make noise, until the sky lightened. The next day, they explored further along the river, hoping to find a more familiar path back. The forest, however, seemed to warp around them. The same trees appeared again and again, every bend in the river, leading them back to the same narrow clearing where the cabin had been. Daniel joked nervously, "I think we're in a loop or something." The others didn't laugh. By the afternoon, the first signs of danger appeared. Footprints in the soft mud surrounded them, large, human-like, but grotesquely elongated, with claw-like toes. They hadn't noticed anyone else around, yet the prints suggested someone, or something, was tracking them. Panic began to set in. As night fell, they tried to stay near the river, hoping to navigate downstream. That night, the sounds escalated. Rustling grew into snapping branches, low growls, and whispers that seemed to call their names. Shadows moved just beyond the firelight, twisting and shifting. The three of them barely slept, and when morning came, Mark noticed something terrifying. Their campfire had been completely destroyed, the ashes scattered and footprints encircling the tent. They debated leaving immediately, but the forest offered no clear path. Every direction seemed wrong, every landmark unfamiliar. The GPS was useless, spinning endlessly. They walked for hours, growing weaker and hungrier, the oppressive sense of being hunted never lifting. On the third night, Daniel vanished. Lisa and Mark woke to find the tent empty, only the faint echo of his scream carried by the wind. They ran through the forest, calling his name, but only silence responded. Eventually exhausted, they stopped, trembling, realizing that the forest was actively keeping them inside. The following days became a blur. They survived on minimal food, drinking from the river when necessary. Every step was cautious. Every sound was terrifying. At times, they caught glimpses of massive shadows between the trees, shapes that moved unnaturally fast, watching, following, waiting. Eventually, they stumbled upon another abandoned structure, a small shack with boarded windows. Inside, they found remnants of old fires, makeshift tools, and symbols carved into the walls. Some of the markings resembled human figures with elongated limbs, eyes wide open, staring. Lisa recoiled, whispering, "It's like they're trying to warn us." They left the shack quickly, moving silently at night, hiding during the day. Sleep was impossible. Every night, the forest seemed closer, suffocating, alive. They could hear breathing, heavy and deliberate, footsteps circling them, and sometimes faint whispers imitating their own voices. On what felt like the seventh day, they finally saw a logging road in the distance. Desperation pushed them to run. When they reached it, they were greeted by an older man in a pickup truck. He looked at them with eyes that had seen far too much. "You shouldn't have been there," he said simply. "That forest, it doesn't like outsiders. People disappear out there. Some never come back." Lisa and Mark got into his truck, too exhausted to respond. As they drove away, the forest receded, but the memory of it stayed vivid. They never saw Daniel again. Even months later, they couldn't shake the nightmares. The whispers, the massive footprints, the oppressive feeling of being watched in a place that didn't exist on any normal map. They never returned to the forest, and they never spoke of it in detail. But every time they hear a twig snap outside at night or a branch scrape against the window, the memory comes back, raw, unshakable, and terrifying. The forest was out there, still waiting, still hungry, and it had claimed one of them. Mark and Lisa eventually tried to move on, but the trauma lingered. Nights were worst when the shadows seemed alive, when whispers that weren't there teased their minds. They realized the forest hadn't just taken Daniel, it had marked them too. And somewhere, deep in the uncharted trees, it still waited for anyone foolish enough to wander into the middle of nowhere. Story the end. I was headed west from Nebraska to Utah, taking back roads because I'd grown tired of the interstate. There's something freeing about driving through the countryside, no billboards, no gas stations every 10 miles, just open sky and long stretches of asphalt. It was the middle of August, hot as hell during the day but cooler at night. My plan was to camp a night or two in some remote areas before continuing to Salt Lake City. I'd done it before without a problem. This time was different. By the second night, I was in a part of Wyoming so empty that the GPS on my phone was showing a blank screen. I didn't think much of it. I had downloaded maps ahead of time and figured I could just follow the back roads. As evening rolled in, the air began to cool, and the sky turned that strange bruised purple you get before a storm. The road narrowed and started winding between hills covered in sagebrush. My car was low on gas, but I told myself I'd see a station soon enough. After another 30 minutes of driving, I passed a sign. It was so weathered I could barely make out the letters. The only thing I could read was Miller's Hollow, 11 miles. I hadn't heard of it before, but I figured it was a small town. Perfect. I could get gas, maybe even stay in a motel. The road to Miller's Hollow was narrower than the one I'd been on. Asphalt gave way to cracked pavement, then dirt. My headlights picked up nothing but sagebrush and occasional barbed wire fences. The air smelled different too, like wet earth, even though it hadn't rained. By the time I reached what the map labeled as Miller's Hollow, darkness had settled. But there was no town. Not even a single building. Just a crumbling stone wall and an old sign bent nearly in half. I slowed the car, scanning for any lights, any movement. Nothing. My stomach knotted. I figured maybe I'd taken the wrong turn, but the GPS still showed I was right where Miller's Hollow should be. I debated turning back, but my gas gauge was just above empty. I needed to find something. I drove on, hoping for a farmhouse or a gas station. That's when I saw a light ahead. It was faint but steady, shining through the dark like a beacon. Relief washed over me. I pressed the accelerator. The road ended abruptly at an old wooden bridge over a dry creek bed. Beyond the bridge, the trees closed in. The light was coming from somewhere beyond the tree line. I drove across, the boards creaking under my tires, and followed a narrow track lined with tall grass. My car's high beams cut through the dark, and that's when I saw the house. It was an old farmhouse, 2 stories, white paint long since peeled away. A single light burned in an upstairs window. Everything else was dark. The house was surrounded by overgrown weeds. There was no car in the driveway, no signs of life, but that light upstairs glowed steady and warm, and for a moment it felt inviting. I parked in front and stepped out, calling out, "Hello, anyone home?" My voice echoed strangely, swallowed by the trees. No answer. I tried again. Louder. Still nothing. The only sound was the creak of the windmill behind the house, slowly spinning in the breeze. I knocked on the front door. It was unlocked. The door swung inward with a groan. The smell hit me first, musty like wet wood and old newspapers. I flicked on my flashlight. The entryway was dusty, the wallpaper peeling, furniture covered with sheets. The air felt heavy like no one had been inside for decades. Still, that light upstairs burned. It was strange. There was no sound of a generator, no hum of electricity, just silence. Against my better judgment, I decided to go upstairs. Each step creaked under my weight. At the top, the hallway stretched into darkness. The door to the lit room was slightly ajar. I could see the glow spilling out onto the floor. I pushed it open slowly. The room was empty, completely empty. No furniture, no lamp, no wires. Just bare wood floors and a single window where the light was coming from. Except there was no bulb, no fixture, nothing. The light just hung in the air like a floating orb, dim and pulsing. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The temperature dropped instantly, my skin prickling with goosebumps. A faint whisper reached my ears, so soft I thought I imagined it. It was my name, clear as day. Eric. My heart slammed against my ribs. No one here knew my name. I turned to leave, but the hallway behind me had changed. It was longer now, the walls warped, wallpaper sagging and wet as if the house itself was breathing. I ran, stumbling down the stairs, nearly falling as I grabbed the banister. The front door was closed, even though I had left it open. I yanked on the knob, but it wouldn't budge. That's when I heard footsteps upstairs, slow, deliberate. Someone, or something, was following me. I pounded on the door until my palms hurt, but it stayed shut. The footsteps reached the top of the stairs. My flashlight flickered. I turned just enough to see a shape at the top. Tall. Thin. Its arms too long, fingers grazing the railing. No face. Just a blank oval where its head should be. I bolted toward the back of the house, found a window, and threw myself through it, landing hard on the overgrown lawn. My hands were bleeding, my knees scraped, but I didn't stop. I sprinted for the car. The engine sputtered, then roared to life. I floored it, tearing down the dirt road as fast as the car would go. In my rearview mirror, I saw the farmhouse. The light in the window was gone now. The house looked darker than before, like it had sunk deeper into the ground. But on the porch stood that figure, watching. Its arms hung limply, but its head tilted slightly as if it knew I was looking. I didn't slow down. I didn't stop until I hit the main highway an hour later. When I finally found a gas station, the clerk looked at me like I was insane, muddy, bleeding, shaking. He asked what happened. I couldn't tell him. How do you explain something like that? I tried to find Miller's Hollow again later. It's not on any map, not even old ones. There's no record of a town by that name. The road I took doesn't seem to exist anymore, but I know what I saw. I know where I was. Sometimes at night, when I'm driving on back roads, I catch a glimpse of a faint light in the distance, a farmhouse, a bridge, a promise of safety. I turn the other way now, every time, because I know if I go toward it again, I won't come back. Story. The end. It was late September when Ethan, his sister Sarah, and their two friends, Cole and Mandy, decided to take a last-minute trip upstate. They were tired of the city's endless noise, its crowded streets, the way their lives felt like someone else's schedule. Ethan had found a listing for a cabin deep in the Catskills, something off the grid and private. No Wi-Fi, no neighbors for miles, just nature and silence. It sounded perfect. The drive started like any other road trip. They blasted music, sang along to old favorites, and teased each other about who would get carsick first. But as they left the main highway and veered onto narrow, twisting backroads, the atmosphere subtly changed. The forest on either side thickened, trees arching over the road like cathedral ceilings, shadows stretching unnaturally even in the late afternoon sun. The GPS began to falter, flickering and recalculating endlessly. "Are we lost?" Mandy asked, glancing nervously out the window. "I think the cabin's around the next bend," Ethan said, trying to sound confident. "It's just a little further than the map said." Hours passed, the sun sinking lower, painting the woods in sharp, unsettling angles. When they finally saw the cabin, it was more isolated than Ethan had imagined. A 2-story wooden structure, weathered and dark with moss creeping along the sides. The gravel driveway ended abruptly at a rusted gate that hung loosely on one hinge. The forest pressed against the cabin on all sides, leaving a narrow strip of land around it. The first night was uneasy, but mostly uneventful. They unpacked, built a small fire in the stone fireplace, and drank wine while sharing stories. But as darkness fell, the wind seemed to carry whispers. Barely audible at first, faint and fleeting, but there. Sarah was the first to notice. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice low. "Hear what?" Cole replied. "That, someone calling my name," she said, clutching her sweater. Ethan laughed nervously. It's probably just the wind through the trees. You know how old cabins sound." But the whispering continued, growing louder, sometimes overlapping, sometimes distant, always elusive. They tried to ignore it, convincing themselves it was just the isolation playing tricks on their minds. On the second day, they decided to explore a nearby trail. It was narrow, barely maintained, and soon the forest swallowed them in green shadows. Birds called intermittently, but nothing seemed to move along the forest floor. The trail looped strangely. Every turn seemed familiar, yet slightly different. Landmarks they were sure they had passed reappeared, trees in impossible positions. Mandy became uneasy, insisting they were walking in circles, but Ethan shrugged it off. That evening, the cabin felt wrong. The air was heavier, colder. Doors that had been closed were slightly ajar. Items they had left in one place were moved, sometimes drastically. Their wine glasses appeared shattered on the floor in the morning, though none of them had touched them. By the third night, the sounds became more distinct, rhythmic pounding on the walls, soft at first, then sharp and urgent. Ethan went to the door, shining a flashlight into the surrounding woods. Nothing. No animals, no humans, just darkness that seemed thicker than night should allow. Then came the shadows. Cole was the first to see them. Flickering, moving at the edge of his vision, tall and thin, too fast to track. When he pointed them out, the others saw nothing. The cabin seemed to shift with the shadows, the walls closing in, the ceiling lower than it had been moments before. The whispers turned to murmurs, growing louder, pressing against the sanity of everyone inside. The fourth night was the breaking point. Sarah woke screaming, convinced something was touching her in the bed. Ethan and Mandy found her at the foot of the stairs, pale, shaking, pointing at the corner of the room. There was nothing there, at least nothing they could see. But the feeling, the oppressive weight of being watched, was undeniable. They decided to leave the next morning. But when Ethan started the car, the battery was dead. No warning, no signs, just dead. Cole tried his phone to call for help. No signal. The forest had swallowed any connection to the outside world. Panic began to replace the earlier unease. By mid-afternoon, they attempted to hike out. The trail betrayed them. Every path led back to the cabin or deeper into the woods. Trees seemed to shift when they weren't looking, creating impossible mazes. Rocks that had been markers disappeared or reappeared in strange locations. They began to argue, fear sharpening their edges, fraying their bonds. As night fell, they huddled together in the cabin, barricading doors and windows. The pounding returned, this time louder, accompanied by groaning noises that echoed unnaturally through the timber and stone. Whispers grew into guttural voices, unintelligible yet threatening. Something seemed to circle the cabin, dragging across the gravel, unseen but audible. By the fifth night, exhaustion and fear took over. Ethan suggested splitting up to search for another exit. Mandy refused, trembling, whispering that leaving alone would be a death sentence. Cole agreed to stay. Ethan ventured out. He never returned. Hours later, Sarah heard a scream, sharp, echoing through the trees, but when she ran toward it, there was only silence. Shadows moved differently now, almost sentient. The whispers became a chant, repeating her name, calling her deeper into the forest. She and Cole stayed inside, too terrified to sleep, too afraid to move. On the sixth night, the cabin itself seemed to change. Hallways that had been straight twisted. Rooms appeared where there had been none. The fireplace glowed coldly, as though containing a presence. They began seeing figures at the edge of their vision. Hunched, featureless, always observing, never approaching directly but always near. By the seventh night, Cole vanished. Sarah woke to find him gone from the living room. The door was open, leading into the black forest beyond. She called for him, stumbled outside, and found nothing, just endless trees, dark and silent. Terrified, she returned to the cabin, barricaded herself, whispering prayers she didn't believe. By the eighth night, Sarah was alone. Exhausted, terrified, the whispers her only companions. She began to feel it in the walls, in the floor. Something watching, breathing, waiting. She swore she heard her own name in the dark, and then footsteps behind her, heavy, deliberate, circling the cabin. She ran, but the forest moved against her, trees twisting, shadows blocking every escape. When search teams finally reached the area weeks later, they found the cabin abandoned. The gravel road had eroded, the forest reclaiming the land. Ethan, Mandy, Cole, and Sarah were never found. Locals who ventured near the site reported feeling watched, hearing soft knocks on trees and whispers carried on the wind. To this day, hikers speak of seeing a cabin in the Catskills that appears and disappears at will. Some say it's haunted by the lost, others claim the forest itself is alive, feeding on those who wander too deep. Visitors report strange phenomena, shadows at the edge of vision, whispers calling names, paths that never lead where they should. Few stay long, and fewer return. Story, the end. It started as a weekend getaway. My friends and I, 5 of us in total, had planned to escape the city and drive out to Tennessee. None of us were particularly outdoorsy, but the idea of being somewhere remote, away from cell service, and completely isolated sounded thrilling. We had a rented SUV and a cooler full of snacks, thinking we'd camp near a lake that one of my coworkers had recommended. By the time we hit the back roads, it was well past sunset. The sun had dipped behind the rolling hills, leaving long shadows across the narrow asphalt. The GPS was unreliable, flickering between searching and showing vague, curving lines that didn't make sense. The air was heavy, humid, and smelled faintly of wet pine. My friend Alex was driving, and I sat in the passenger seat with my phone out, trying to find some semblance of cell signal. "It's fine," Alex said, smirking. "We'll just follow the map I printed. How bad could it be?" I didn't argue. Behind us, Lisa, Mark, and Tyler were dozing lightly, occasionally cracking jokes about being lost in the wilderness. We laughed along, though there was an unspoken unease. The road had narrowed to a single lane, twisting through dense forest. Every turn seemed the same as the last, every tree identical, looming over the SUV like silent sentinels. After about an hour, we reached a split in the road. The printed directions said to take a left, but the path ahead looked overgrown and barely passable. A rusted, half-collapsed sign leaned into the forest. It was impossible to read. Alex hesitated. "Left?" he asked. "Yes," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. Something about the overgrowth and the thick shadows gnawed at me. The tires crunched along the dirt path, brushing against rocks and fallen branches. The forest pressed close, so close that headlights barely reached beyond a few feet. Occasionally, I thought I saw movement just off the road, dark shapes between the trees, but each time I blinked, it was gone. About 45 minutes in, we came across a clearing. There was a cabin in the center, small and weathered, leaning slightly to one side. Its windows were dark, and the door hung loosely on its hinges. A fire pit in front had been long abandoned, the charred wood cracked and splintered. "Great," Lisa said, her voice tight. "This is cute." She laughed nervously, but there was a tremor in her tone. We decided to set up tents nearby rather than sleep inside the cabin, even though curiosity gnawed at us. We tried to make it fun, roasting marshmallows, telling stories, but the forest was too silent, the air too thick. Every snap of a branch, every rustle of leaves made us jump. Around 1:30 a.m., we started hearing noises from the cabin. At first, it was subtle, just faint scratching. Then it became rhythmic, deliberate, like someone dragging their nails along the walls. Tyler suggested raccoons or some other animal, but the noise was too precise, too methodical. Alex finally said, "I'm going to check it out." I wanted to go with him, but something about the place made me hesitate. He shined his flashlight through the windows, and the beam caught a figure inside, crouched in the corner. Its face was hidden, but its eyes glowed faintly in the light. He froze, then stumbled back. "There's someone or something inside," he whispered. We debated leaving immediately, but curiosity and the absurdity of the situation kept us rooted. I suggested we peek inside together. When we pushed open the cabin door, the smell hit first, a mix of rot, decay, and something metallic like old blood. The floorboards creaked under our weight. Shadows moved at the edge of our vision. In the far corner, there was a small pile of objects, bones, small personal items, and photographs. The pictures were of people, strangers smiling at the camera. But in each photo, the eyes were scratched out, some partially torn, some just deep black voids. Suddenly, the door slammed behind us. A figure emerged from the corner. Tall, thin, its movements jerky, unnatural, almost like it was controlling its own body poorly. It didn't speak, didn't breathe audibly. It just stood, staring, and the air seemed to thicken around it. We ran, bursting out of the cabin. The forest outside was no longer familiar. Trees seemed closer, darker, looming over us as though closing in. Our flashlights flickered, and for a moment I thought I saw hundreds of shadows moving between the trees, more than just one. We piled back into the SUV and tried to start the engine. It stalled, repeatedly. Outside, the scratching and knocking started again, circling the car. Alex gunned the engine when it finally caught, and we sped down the dirt road, trying to retrace our path. Hours seemed to pass. Every curve, every dip in the road felt endless. The forest never thinned. We started to notice shapes in the road, figures standing just beyond the headlights. They didn't move initially, but as we approached, they began to step aside slowly, only to appear again further down the path. The feeling of being watched was suffocating, our panic mounting with every passing minute. By the time we reached a stretch of paved road, the first signs of civilization, no one spoke. The shadows that had followed us were gone, but the memory of their movement lingered, heavy and cold. When we finally reached the next town, we pulled into a gas station, shaking and silent. Local authorities had no record of the cabin or the clearing. Old logging roads, the clerk muttered vaguely. People disappear sometimes. Nothing official. We never returned to Tennessee. None of us wanted to talk about it for months. The dreams came first, sleeping, waking, and sometimes seeing the shadows at the edge of our vision. Occasionally, I'd wake to a tapping sound, soft but insistent, coming from the walls of my apartment. And every time I hear it, I think back to the cabin, the forest, and those figures standing perfectly still, waiting. Some things are real, some things follow you, and some places exist in a way that the normal world can't touch, yet they touch you in ways you can never shake. That weekend, that road, that cabin, they weren't just a story. They were a reminder that some roads in the middle of nowhere lead to places you're not meant to return from. Even now, years later, I drive carefully when I see a road vanish into dense forest, remembering how quickly the ordinary can become unrecognizable. And when the wind moves just right, sometimes I hear faint scratching, and I know there are places that remember us, even if we've long forgotten them. Story the end.